Friday nights in the 1990s had a rhythm that millions of households never forgot. Dinner was cleared from the table, parents settled into armchairs, kids stretched out on the carpet, and the glow of the television brought comfort. For many families, that comfort had a name: Family Matters. It wasn't just a sitcom, it was a ritual. The Winslows became neighbors we all felt we knew. The living room became as familiar as our own, and laughter filled the air with every catchphrase and stumble. It looked like television at its warmest, a safe space where family always came first. But what if that image was a carefully polished surface? What if the family you welcomed into your home every week wasn't the family the creators set out to show? What if the warmth concealed fractures, compromises, and quiet conflicts that would shape the show's legacy in ways few fans ever realized? That's the hidden layer of Family Matters. Behind the catchy theme song, behind Carl's exasperated sighs and Harriet's steady guidance, behind Eddie's mischief and Laura's brilliance, there was a different story unfolding. A story about a show designed for one woman that became dominated by another presence entirely. A story about promises made, promises broken, and the irony of television magic, how an accident of casting could rewrite everything. To understand it, we have to return to a world where network television still ruled. The late 1980s were dominated by the idea of family programming, safe, relatable shows that brought parents and children together. ABC's TGIF lineup was more than scheduling. It was branding, a declaration that Friday night belonged to family entertainment. Into that world stepped the Winslows, meant to ground TGIF with stories of love, discipline, humor, and resilience. And yet, what happened next is the reason we're still talking about Family Matters decades later. A character who was never supposed to exist, a nerdy neighbor invented for a one-off gag, became the gravitational force that pulled the series away from its core. He didn't just change the show's trajectory, he reshaped careers, altered relationships, and even left scars. The series that promised that Family Matters ended up raising the question: what really mattered more, the family or the phenomenon? So let's pull back the curtain. Let's retrace the steps, the triumphs, and the struggles that turned a modest spinoff into a cultural juggernaut. Because once you see what was really happening behind the Winslow's front door, you'll never watch Family Matters the same way again. To understand the story of Family Matters, you have to rewind to a moment when network television was still the heartbeat of American culture. The year was 1989. Cable had begun to nibble at the edges, but the big three, ABC, CBS, and NBC, still dictated what millions of households would laugh at, cry over, and discuss around the water cooler on Monday mornings. Then ABC was in the middle of creating something that would define an entire generation: the TGIF lineup. TGIF, thank goodness it's Friday, wasn't just a slogan, it was a brand. 4 sitcoms back to back, carefully chosen to attract families settling in at the end of the week. The idea was simple but powerful. Friday night belonged to ABC, and ABC belonged to you. Anchored by shows like Full House and Perfect Strangers, TGIF became must-see television for anyone who wanted laughter without the edge, family values without lectures, and a feeling of home even if your own family was complicated. It was from Perfect Strangers that Family Matters emerged. On that show, viewers had been introduced to Harriet Winslow, a sharp-tongued, no-nonsense elevator operator played by Jo Marie Payton. In scene after scene, Payton stole the spotlight. She wasn't the lead, but she had presence. Audiences saw it, and more importantly, so did producers William Bickley and Michael Warren. They asked themselves, what if Harriet didn't just ride elevators in a supporting role? What if she became the anchor of her own series? And so the Winslows were born. The new show was pitched not as a wild comedy, but as a grounded portrait of a middle-class black family living in Chicago. Harriet would be the matriarch, her husband Carl, played by Reginald VelJohnson, fresh off his beloved turn as sergeant. Al Powell in Die Hard would be the steady but often frazzled father. Together they would navigate life with their 3 children: Eddie, the rebellious eldest; Laura, the bright and ambitious middle child; and Judy, the youngest, still finding her way. The Winslow household was designed to feel real. The set was modeled after a typical Chicago home, filled not with luxury, but with warmth. To expand the dynamics, Harriet's sister Rachel and her baby moved in, along with Carl's mother, Estelle. Suddenly, you had three generations under one roof, a recipe for both comedy and heart. It was meant to be Jo Marie Payton's moment. She had worked for years in supporting roles, and now finally she was the face of a primetime network sitcom. The promise was clear. Family Matters would tell her story, the challenges, triumphs, and laughter of a working-class mother who refused to be overlooked. But the television landscape is rarely predictable. A show built carefully around one woman's strength would within months be hijacked by a character who wasn't even in the original blueprint. The foundation was laid for a family-centered comedy, but fate had other plans. And those plans would arrive, quite literally, with a knock at the door. At first glance, the Winslows were the picture of balance. Harriet Winslow brought a firm but loving voice to every episode. Carl Winslow, forever exasperated but deeply loyal, was the kind of father figure television thrived on. Their children each played their part in the rhythm of family life. Eddie's mischief, Laura's brilliance, Judy's sweetness. And surrounding them were relatives who added color and texture. From Rachel's resilience as a single mother to Estelle's wisdom as the grandmother who'd seen it all. It was an ensemble that worked because it felt real. Family Matters didn't debut with fireworks, it debuted with warmth. Viewers knew families like this, where aunts lived under the same roof, where discipline was tempered by humor, and where everyday struggles carried as much weight as big triumphs. In a television landscape often dominated by extremes, Family Matters promised something relatable. But hidden in that promise was a paradox that would soon come to define the entire series. The show's title suggested stability, loyalty, and the importance of the family unit. Yet the show itself was about to orbit around someone outside the family altogether. It wasn't Harriet who would be remembered. It wasn't Carl, or Eddie, or even Laura. It was a character who wasn't even supposed to stay past one script. The paradox lay in the tension between intention and reality. Behind the scenes, Jo Marie Payton had been told this was her star vehicle. It was her chance to step out from the shadows and lead. But what the audience saw, week after week, would become less about her character's strength and more about a boy in suspenders, glasses too large for his face, and a squeaky voice that could both annoy and endear in the same breath. The Winslows' living room, once the center of gravity, became a stage for someone who wasn't in the blueprint. Publicly, the show was sold as a family comedy, but privately the cast began to feel a shift. The paradox deepened with every laugh track that erupted for the neighbor next door. For the Winslow actors, the experience was disorienting. On one hand, they were part of a hit show. The ratings were climbing, the Friday night audience was growing, and their place in television history was being written. On the other hand, the attention, the press, and the adoration were increasingly focused on one figure. What had begun as Harriet's story was turning into Urkel's phenomenon. The show's greatest irony had begun to unfold. A sitcom meant to explore the lives of a family in Chicago would become remembered, perhaps unfairly, as the story of someone who didn't belong to that family at all. The paradox was clear. The Winslows gave the show its heart, but the neighbor gave it its identity. And then, with one audition and one unforgettable laugh, the decision was sealed, the decision that changed everything. Sometimes history pivots on the smallest of moments, the kind nobody in the room thinks will matter until it changes everything. For Family Matters, that moment arrived in the 12th episode of the first season. The script called for a simple gag. Laura Winslow, the teenage daughter, would be set up on a blind date with a boy so awkward, so ill-suited, that it would play for laughs and then be forgotten. He was meant to appear once, a face in the crowd. Nothing more. But when 12-year-old Jaleel White walked into the audition room, the atmosphere shifted. He wasn't wearing a costume, not exactly, but he had prepared something more than lines. From his father, a dentist, he borrowed an oversized pair of glasses. From his mother's closet came pants just a bit too small, yanked up far too high. And from somewhere inside himself, White conjured a voice, a shuffle, and a persona that was wholly original. He didn't just play the role of a nerd. He embodied Steve Urkel. The producers were stunned. Here was a child actor who didn't audition. He transformed. By the time the cameras rolled, the studio audience couldn't contain themselves. Every time White appeared, laughter and applause thundered. He hadn't just delivered a performance, he had created a phenomenon. The episode, Laura's First Date, aired on December 15th, 1989. Within days, letters poured in from fans demanding more of the peculiar neighbor with the squeaky voice. That was the moment the decision was made. The producers huddled and agreed. This couldn't be a one-time gag. Urkel was here to stay. Writers scrambled to insert him into episodes already filmed, staging quick gags where the Winslows tried to bar the door while Urkel forced his way inside. What had been Harriet Winslow's show, the series promised to Jo Marie Payton as her vehicle, was now bending toward a boy in suspenders. The results were immediate. Ratings jumped. Suddenly, Family Matters was no longer a modest sitcom in danger of fading. It was a hit. Steve Urkel's clumsy brilliance had turned the series into the anchor of TGIF. But for every laugh that echoed from living rooms across America, there was a quieter sound on set, the creak of shifting ground beneath the ensemble cast. What had begun as a promise of shared storytelling now revolved around one star. The decision had saved the show from likely cancellation, but it had also rewritten its destiny. The Winslows were no longer the center of their own story. The heart of the show was beating differently now, and the cost of that decision would become clear in the years to come. Because when you build a family sitcom around a neighbor, the family starts to fade. And that reality was about to hit home. On television, the Winslows' home looked like the happiest place in Chicago. The living room echoed with laughter, family lessons wrapped neatly by the end of each half hour, and the neighbor next door kept audiences in stitches. But behind the camera, the reality was far more complicated. Jo Marie Payton, who had been promised a starring role, suddenly found herself watching her presence shrink week by week. Instead of Harriet's perspective shaping storylines, scripts were rewritten to highlight Steve Urkel's antics, inventions gone wrong, slapstick accidents, and endless variations of "did I do that?" For a woman who had worked her way up from supporting roles, the shift was disheartening. Reginald VelJohnson, too, felt the change. He had been cast as Carl Winslow because producers saw in him the perfect father figure, stern but with a heart of gold. Early episodes leaned into his police officer background, his struggle to support a family on a working-class salary, and his constant tug-of-war with the chaos in his household. But once Urkel caught fire, even Carl's character began to orbit around the neighbor. Instead of grounding the show, he was often written as a straight man to Urkel's absurdity. The younger cast felt it as well. Darius McCrary, who played Eddie, and Kelly Shanae Williams, who played Laura, were coming of age on the show. They had signed on to portray relatable teens navigating school, family, and growing pains. But as Urkel's gadgets grew more elaborate, jetpacks, cloning machines, transformation chambers, their arcs began to feel secondary. Even Jaleel White, despite his meteoric rise, bore the strain. In later interviews, he admitted the atmosphere was tense. He felt that some of the adults resented him for stealing the spotlight, even though the decision to expand his role wasn't his to make. VelJohnson would later acknowledge that working with a child star who became a global celebrity overnight was difficult, not because White lacked talent, but because the balance of power had shifted so drastically. By the third season, network memos were clear. Audiences tuned in for Urkel. Scripts leaned further into spectacle, with writers encouraged to push beyond realism into cartoonish comedy. But that shift carried a cost. What had once been a family-driven sitcom grounded in relatable moments, Harriet guiding her kids, Carl juggling work and home life, became increasingly about how the Winslows reacted to Urkel's chaos. For the cast, who had believed they were part of a show about family, it was a hard reality to swallow. Audiences laughed louder than ever, but the foundation of the Winslows story was quietly cracking. And the first sign of that fracture would soon become impossible to ignore, because one family member was about to disappear altogether. For audiences watching on Friday nights, the Winslows seemed like any other sitcom family. Imperfect but loving, full of squabbles that always resolved by the end of the half hour. Eddie was still sneaking out, Laura was still excelling in school, Carl was still sighing after long shifts, and Harriet was still holding the family together. But sharp-eyed viewers began to notice something odd. By the middle of the show's run, one of the Winslow children had simply vanished. Judy Winslow, the youngest daughter, played by Jaime Foxworth, was there in the early years. She was bright, bubbly, and often leaned on her big sister for guidance. In the rhythm of the family, she was the grounding presence of a little sister who reminded the audience of innocence amid the chaos. But during the fifth season, Judy walked upstairs in one episode and never came back down. She wasn't written out, she wasn't explained away, she simply disappeared. For years, fans scratched their heads. How could a show about family erase a family member without a word? The mystery became one of television's strangest running jokes. But behind the scenes, the truth wasn't funny. Producers had decided Judy's character wasn't essential anymore. With Steve Urkel dominating plots and screen time, Judy no longer fit the direction the show was heading. And so, at just 13 years old, Jaime Foxworth was let go. The decision was handled with shocking coldness. When Jo Marie Payton protested, asking how they could remove a daughter from the Winslow family, she was told flatly, "Nobody will notice." To her, it was more than creative trimming. It was erasing the very foundation of what the show claimed to stand for. Family Matters, the title said. Yet one of their own had been discarded without explanation. For Foxworth, the firing was devastating. She had grown up on the set, believing she was part of a long future with the Winslows. Instead, she was left without closure, both on screen and in her real life. The abrupt end to her role damaged her confidence, leaving her to question her talent and her place in the industry. Years later, she would speak candidly about how painful it was to be written out, not just of a show, but of a family she thought she belonged to. When fans approached Jo Marie Payton in public, they didn't ask producers where Judy had gone. They asked her, as if Harriet herself owed an answer. It was a burden she carried for years. The disappearance of Judy Winslow is more than a curious footnote. It was the first clear sign of the cracks behind the laughter. It revealed how far producers were willing to bend or break the very premise of the show in pursuit of ratings, and it wouldn't be the last time the cast confronted decisions that revealed just how fragile the family really was. By the mid-1990s, Family Matters was at the height of its popularity. Steve Urkel was everywhere. Dolls on toy store shelves, cereal boxes in supermarkets, even crossover appearances on other hit sitcoms. For ABC, this was a dream come true. For the cast who had signed on to play the Winslows, it was something else entirely. The reality was clear. The show that began as Harriet Winslow's story had turned into the Steve Urkel Show. Jo Marie Payton, who had built her career slowly and steadily, now watched as her role shrank with each passing season. Harriet's wisdom, once the anchor of the series, was increasingly pushed to the sidelines, her screen time cut down to accommodate new Urkel storylines. Payton later admitted it hurt deeply, not just professionally, but personally. She had been promised a chance to lead. Instead, she was being erased from the spotlight on her own show. Reginald VelJohnson, the actor behind Carl Winslow, echoed the strain. Carl had been envisioned as the gruff but big-hearted father whose interactions with Harriet and the children formed the emotional core. Yet, as seasons went on, he was often rewritten as the perpetual foil to Urkel's schemes. Whether it was dealing with exploding gadgets, cleaning up messes, or playing the exasperated straight man, Carl's identity was increasingly tied to someone outside the family he was meant to represent. The younger cast also felt the shift. Darius McCrary, playing Eddie, and Kelly Shaneen Williams, playing Laura, had expected arcs of growth and maturity. Instead, their storylines bent around Urkel's endless pursuit of Laura, or Eddie's role as his sometimes friend, sometimes bully. Even Jaime Foxworth, before being written out, sensed the imbalance. The family was no longer the driver of the show, they were orbiting around the neighbor. The tension became open conflict during the final season. Jo Marie Payton later recounted a moment when Jaleel White, by then a teenager, pushed for a scene she believed violated the network's standards. When she refused, tempers flared. Payton described the incident as explosive, saying she felt White had been given too much unchecked power by producers desperate to keep him happy. It was only when co-star Darius McCrary stepped in that the moment de-escalated. There were other battles too, ones less about ego and more about respect. In one script, writers had included a racially offensive joke aimed at a guest character. Peyton and Vel Johnson were horrified, and together they fought until it was removed. For them, it wasn't just about protecting themselves. It was about protecting the dignity of the show's audience. On screen, Family Matters delivered laughs, but off screen, the cast was fighting for recognition, respect, and their rightful place in the story. And in the middle of that struggle lay an irony that no one could ignore. The greatest irony of Family Matters was baked right into its title. The words suggested that the show would always be about one thing: the importance of family. Yet the longer it ran, the clearer it became that family, at least the Winslow family, wasn't what kept the series alive. It was the boy next door, the one who was never meant to stay. Steve Urkel was supposed to be forgettable, a punchline who walked in and walked right back out. Instead, he became the gravitational center of the show, eclipsing the very people who were promised that spotlight. Harriet's voice, once strong and unshakable, was drowned out by catchphrases. Carl's moral lessons were overshadowed by pratfalls. Even Eddie and Laura, the kids' audiences had been asked to invest in from the beginning, were rewritten to serve Urkel's orbit. And Judy, she was erased entirely. This irony didn't just play out in the scripts, it shaped careers. For Jo Marie Peyton, Family Matters had been pitched as her star vehicle, the chance to prove that she could carry a series on her shoulders. Instead, she found herself pushed aside in her own show. For Reginald VelJohnson, a respected actor who had earned audience love through Die Hard, the opportunity to build on that success was complicated by a role that became increasingly one-dimensional. The family members were recognizable faces, but they weren't cultural icons. Jaleel White was, and therein lay another irony. While Urkel gave the show its longevity, he also gave White a label he could never quite escape. Other actors from the TGIF era found ways to pivot. Will Smith, on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, used his sitcom as a launchpad to superstardom, building a career in music and blockbuster films. But Jaleel White was never Jaleel White to the world. He was Urkel. The suspenders, the glasses, the squeaky voice. They clung to him long after the cameras stopped rolling. In his memoir, White later admitted that being synonymous with Urkel was both a blessing and a curse, a role that made him famous, but also trapped him in a box he couldn't easily break free from. And so the irony doubled back on itself. A show about family sidelined its family to serve a neighbor. An actor who created one of the most beloved characters of the 1990s discovered that the same creation limited his career for decades. Success and sacrifice were intertwined in ways no one had expected. The Winslows had set the table, but Urkel ate the meal. And yet, in spite of all this tension, Family Matters achieved something few shows of its era managed. It broke through. By its second season, Family Matters had done something few shows ever accomplish. It transformed from a modest spin-off into a cultural phenomenon. And the credit for that transformation rested squarely on the shoulders of a single character who wasn't even supposed to be there. Steve Urkel had gone from a one-time gag to the anchor of ABC's prized TGIF lineup, and his rise marked the show's true breakthrough. Suddenly, Family Matters wasn't just another family sitcom. It was the show everyone was talking about on Monday mornings. Kids imitated Urkel's high-pitched voice in classrooms. Teenagers copied his awkward dance moves at parties. And adults, even if they claimed to roll their eyes, couldn't help but laugh when he barged through the Winslows' front door. His catchphrase, "Did I do that?" became a national punchline, repeated so often it felt like part of the American vocabulary. The network noticed. Merchandise deals quickly followed. Urkel dolls flew off toy store shelves, his image appeared on lunch boxes and T-shirts, and Kellogg's even released a limited edition cereal called Urkel Us. For ABC, the character was a dream come true, a sitcom role that had crossed into the wider culture, driving not just ratings but revenue. But the breakthrough wasn't only commercial, it was cultural. Family Matters joined The Cosby Show and later The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as one of the few mainstream sitcoms centered on a black family. For many young viewers of color, the Winslows were a reflection rarely seen in primetime. Even as the focus shifted heavily toward Urkel, the very existence of the Winslow family on television mattered. It broadened the definition of who could lead a sitcom, and it carved a place in the cultural imagination that still resonates today. Still, the path to breakthrough was complicated. For the cast, the soaring popularity of Urkel was both a blessing and a burden. Ratings meant job security. The show survived 9 seasons largely because audiences couldn't get enough of Urkel's antics. But that same success meant that storylines became increasingly outlandish. Urkel building a time machine, cloning himself, or transforming into his suave alter ego, Stefan Urquell. What had begun as a grounded family sitcom sometimes felt more like science fiction. By 1991, Family Matters was pulling in over 12 million viewers weekly, making it one of the highest-rated shows in ABC's lineup. The breakthrough cemented Family Matters as a fixture of the 1990s, but it also confirmed what the cast had long suspected. The Winslows were no longer the true stars. They had been overshadowed, their arcs compressed, their struggles rewritten to fit around Urkel's spotlight. It was a paradox, but it was also undeniable. Without Urkel, the Winslows might never have lasted past the first season. With him, they became television history, and as the 1990s moved forward, the ripples of that success began to spread far beyond the set in Chicago. When the final curtain fell on Family Matters in 1998, the laughter stopped echoing from the Winslows' living room, but the aftershocks were only beginning. 9 seasons and 215 episodes had created a cultural landmark, and now the cast had to navigate the question that always comes after a long-running show. What next? For Jo Marie Payton, the end was bittersweet. She had fought for her role, pushed back against decisions she believed compromised the show's integrity, and ultimately left before the series was over. Yet her career hardly ended with Harriet Winslow. She lent her voice to the animated hit The Proud Family, where her role as the hilarious Sugar Mama became just as iconic to a new generation. For Payton, the ripple was proof that her talent stretched far beyond the shadow of Urkel. Reginald VelJohnson embraced the typecasting that might have frustrated others. He leaned into the image of the gruff but lovable authority figure, playing variations of Carl Winslow across guest appearances in dozens of shows. He became a familiar face in CSI, Monk, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and even animated series where his voice carried the weight of nostalgia. For VelJohnson, the ripple effect was legacy. He would forever be the dependable figure audiences trusted. Jaleel White faced the hardest road. For nearly a decade, he had been Steve Urkel to millions, and shaking that label proved nearly impossible. He tried with his own sitcom, Grown Ups, but it lasted just 1 season. He turned to voice acting, making history as the first American voice of Sonic the Hedgehog in animated series. He landed guest spots on shows like Boston Legal and House. Still, every interview, every appearance circled back to Urkel. For White, the ripple was both a gift and a cage. The younger actors, like Darius McCrary and Kelly Shaneen Williams, also carried the ripples. McCrary found steady work, even voicing Jazz in Michael Bay's Transformers film, while Williams eventually stepped away from Hollywood to raise her family and work in community outreach. Jamie Foxworth, erased from the show as Judy Winslow, struggled the most. For years, she spoke candidly about how difficult it was to be cut from a family sitcom and how that decision impacted her confidence and career. Beyond the cast, the ripples stretched into television itself. Family Matters proved that a show centered on a Black family could anchor a primetime lineup for nearly a decade. Its blend of humor, heart, and cultural identity influenced later series, from My Wife and Kids to Blackish. Even when critics rolled their eyes at the more outlandish Urkel storylines, the legacy of representation endured. When CBS picked up the show for its final season, it was proof of just how far the ripples had spread. Rival networks recognized its cultural staying power. But ripples are unpredictable. They carry progress, yes, but also consequences. For every career revitalized, there was one trapped by typecasting. For every cultural door opened, there was a reminder of the sacrifices behind the smiles. And through those ripples, one question lingered. Why does Family Matters still endure, decades later? Decades have passed since the last new episode of Family Matters aired. Yet the Winslows' living room still feels alive in reruns, streaming marathons, and the memories of those who grew up with it. That persistence raises an important question. Why does this show endure when so many others from the same era have faded into trivia? Part of the answer is simple nostalgia. For millions of viewers, Family Matters is inseparable from childhood Friday nights. The TGIF lineup was a ritual, and the Winslows were at its center. Hearing the theme song or seeing Urkel bumble through a doorway instantly transports fans back to a time when life felt lighter, when problems could be resolved in 22 minutes, and when laughter filled the end of the week. That emotional connection is powerful, and it lingers even when the details of specific episodes blur. But endurance isn't just about sentimentality. Family Matters continues to resonate because beneath the slapstick and catchphrases, the show carried universal themes. Families fight, misunderstand each other, and struggle to keep balance. Parents worry about their children, children push against boundaries and extended. Relatives bring both comedy and chaos. These were not extraordinary stories, but familiar ones. Even when the writers leaned into outrageous inventions and science fiction twists, at the heart of each episode was a recognizable human truth. Families endure because they stay together through change. Representation also plays a central role in the show's lasting impact. In an era when primetime television offered limited portrayals of black families, the Winslows stood tall. They were working class, multi-generational, and layered with both flaws and virtues. For young viewers of color, seeing themselves on screen mattered deeply. For others, it expanded understanding of what family on television could look like. That visibility, though often overshadowed by Urkel's spectacle, remains part of the legacy. Then there is the character of Steve Urkel himself. Love him or tire of him, he is unforgettable. Few sitcom characters in television history have transcended their shows to become cultural icons, but Urkel did. His presence keeps Family Matters alive in pop culture references, memes, and nostalgic callbacks. He is the hook that draws new generations to discover the show, even if they come for the catchphrase and stay for the family. In 2017, Entertainment Weekly called Urkel one of television's top 50 characters of all time, proof that the persona created in a single audition still resonates decades later. Why does Family Matters endure? Because it captured something both timeless and ironic, the unpredictability of family itself. Plans shift, roles change, accidents rewrite destinies, but through it all, the bonds remain. The Winslows, reshaped and redefined though they were, carried that truth, and audiences continue to see themselves in it. And that endurance sets the stage for one last reflection. What hidden truths does the story reveal when we look back with fresh eyes? Behind the laughter and the heartwarming moments, Family Matters wasn't just about the Winslows. It was about how television itself can be reshaped by a single accident of casting. What began as a sitcom centered on Harriet Winslow and her family transformed into The Steve Urkel Show, rewriting careers, creating cultural icons, and leaving behind as many scars as triumphs. Yet for all the conflicts, erasures, and ironies, the show endures. It endures because audiences still recognize themselves in the messy, imperfect, but resilient bonds that define the Winslows. When you revisit the series today, you don't just see nostalgia. You see the hidden history, the shifts, the compromises, and the resilience that most fans never figured out. So here's the question. Was Family Matters truly about family, or was it always about the phenomenon that stole the spotlight? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more hidden stories behind the shows you thought you knew.